Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Greetings to you on this show, this WCAT show we thought you'd like to know. And I'm Dr. Ronda Chervin, Emeritus Professor at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Philosophy, but also the writer of many books and a TV and radio presenter. And I want to talk today about a wonderful new first novel of a writer whose name is Daniel Fitzpatrick. And he wrote this novel, Only the Lover Sings, which takes place during the hurricane floods of New Orleans some time back, and is really about a young man's coming of age in different ways in relationship to nature, the family, to his best friend who becomes an atheist, just as he's becoming more and more aware of the reality of Christ in the church. So I want to greet Daniel Fitzpatrick, and the name of the book, which is published by En Route Books, the same publisher that runs this radio show, is Only the Lover Sings. So Daniel, would you tell us a few words about why you wrote this book, and what the title means to you?
Sure, Rhonda. Well, thanks so much for having this interview with me. It's a pleasure always to speak with you. And so I began writing this book, I think it was in the summer of 2015, after about 10 years of reflecting on the events of Hurricane Katrina back in August and September of 2005, when my family's house was flooded there in New Orleans, Louisiana. And we spent the next year or so moving all around the South, going from one temporary home to another, eventually finding our way back home. And in the midst of this, I went through a kind of spiritual crisis involving my best friend growing up. And basically, it was kind of a strange situation to my mind, in that I had this best friend who grew up just a couple of blocks from me. And we grew up under essentially identical circumstances. But at the time of the storm, as you mentioned, kind of for me was a time of spiritual awakening. And for my best friend, it was a time eventually of turning to atheism. And so that's kind of the main conflict that's drawn out in the book. And I titled it Only the Lover Sings, partly because at the time I started actually writing the novel, I had just finished reading Joseph Pieper's work by that same title, and it's a title that he took from St. Augustine. And Pieper's work is a reflection mostly on the power of art and contemplation, and the idea that art essentially arises out of the soul's desire to sing of its realization of the beauty of the world all around it. And so the book, is not only, kind of a spiritual love song, but it's also a lot of the singing that takes place is a result of the main character's development of his understanding of and appreciation for art and beauty. Many of the characters in the book are driven by a desire to create, whether it's music or poetry, or even if it's just the craft of building a family, rebuilding a home after a devastating flood, and in all of this, we're reminded that creation is sort of God's singing, as it were, his singing being into existence, kind of borrowing that image from C.S. Lewis in his Chronicles of Narnia series, where Aslan sings all of creation into being. And so the book, in a lot of ways, it's laid out in 7 chapters, And so each chapter is meant to be a reflection on one of the days of the Genesis 1 creation story, where God, speaks, or if we interpret it a little more freely, we might imagine him singing, through the word, all of creation into being.
A long time ago, I read something that some physicists actually did think that the basics of reality is music, that reality is music at its essential base. But in any case, could you give the reader an idea of your style by reading something aloud for us?
Sure. Let me pull something up here.
Well, how did you get Michael O'Brien to read it?
Well, that was a strange coincidence. Well, coincidence very loosely. I should say providentially. I happened to be in New Orleans at the same time as he was for Jesuit ordinations in the summer of 2016, I think. And by chance, friends asked me to be Mr. O'Brien and Mrs. O'Brien's chauffeur over that weekend. So I was able to have some long conversations. Actually, first with Sheila O'Brien, his wife, and she sort of interceded for me with him. After hearing that I had written a novel, she and I had a long conversation in the car, and then took me to Mr. O'Brien later and said, "Michael, I want you to help this man." And so he said, "Yes, I will help you." And he had me send him a copy of the manuscript, and really enjoyed it. So that was another great stroke of providence, for certain.
Yeah. Well, listen, if you can't get this thing to work, I think we should go on to something else.
Okay, I've got it pulled back up now. So.
Oh, it's back up. Oh, okay. Well, if Sebastian has time, we can just cut out all of this part.
Sure. Okay. So let's see. Let me read. I'll just read a brief section here. So this is right at the beginning of chapter 1. Maybe even these. And it was long before then, almost as long before as could be for him, and he lay staring into the galaxy of motes swirling down the light toward the green couch as a faint sickness crept over him. He wondered vaguely at the dust and the light and all that the light missed, and at the image of his father, bent over a vacuum or risen on tiptoe to brush a mounted bird's wing. And at length he rose and stepped through the thin wooden door with its loose lock and out into the humid sun, so hot that he shivered as he did in descending to a bath, and he slipped through a gap between the gray board fence and the pink brick of the house, and wandered past the neighbor's burnt-out forno, and found himself in the green shade of the great live oak. And being less afraid then, he pored over the litter for some sign of the bright birds who summered in the canopy, the cardinal, the blue jay, the mockingbird and mourning dove. And never until he had discovered some bright symbol would he walk home, usually by way of the burning sidewalk, cracked here and again by the brooding oaks, and glide through the sticky Douglas firs that framed the front yard and back inside by the front door.
Very beautiful. Okay. Now, this is what I experienced at reading. It happens that I'm one of those readers who some writers regret exist even, who skip over nature scenes because we're interested in character and plot and not in nature scenery. But
Sure.
His writing is so beautiful about this young man's relationship to the wonder and beauty of the various aspects of nature, that it actually forces a reader such as me not only to read these beautiful poetic writings, but also to see nature differently myself because of this perspective, to stop taking it for granted as just a backdrop for my own thoughts and feelings about my day, and just let these aspects of God's creation, how God sang them into existence, let them inspire and soothe and lift and wonder, which is very, very important. One of the main themes in the book, which I found very interesting because I'm a woman and I had only one sister, and so I never knew firsthand until my own son, I never was familiar with the way boys think, especially teenage boys among themselves. Yeah. And this description of your relationship to this friend, who I assume you had such a friend in reality yourself, it gave me a whole different perspective on this combination of closeness and camaraderie and different things that you did together, and also this bonding of the soul. So could you talk a little bit about that for our listeners?
Certainly. And that of course, so the relationship between Roman and Frances in the novel is of course based on my friendship with my best friend growing up. It's also sort of literarily modeled on the relationship between Charles Ryder and Sebastian Flyte in Evelyn Waugh's novel Not Only Lover Sings, Brideshead Revisited. And in that novel, their relationship is sort of described as this first great love, where the friendship between these two young men sort of paves the way for sexual relationships later on, relationships between a husband and wife, and so that's something that I was drawing on a lot in the novel, is this sense in which there's a great intimacy, I think, often between young teenage boys, where it's a relationship where they're preparing in many ways for marriage. There's a kind of total reliance one upon the other, a total security in each other, and yet there's still, obviously in the relationship between the two in the book, it's also a preparation for the fact that every relationship is subordinate to the relationship between the soul and God.
Okay. Very, very well put. Now, do you think possibly, this is just a speculative question, but it came to my mind after reading your wonderful book, is do you think some people now in this culture where same-sex attraction is so touted as a good, do you think that some young people just assume that if they feel that close to a same-sex friend, that they should have sex with them?
I think probably yes. And that's, of course you see that in, and my perspective is, I guess, very strongly literary in a lot of ways, but if you look, starting just with literary criticism, there's a sense in which any intimate relationship between, two young men or two young women is immediately taken to be, a homosexual relationship. And so I'm sure, in an age where, there's tremendous ontological confusion, there will, I'm sure that's a challenge for many young people to think that, any intimacy that I feel for a friend of the same sex must be sexual in some way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's a.
However,
that's
there's nothing of that in this book, and so I think the book could be something very good for someone to read who is going through, say, a phase of such same-sex attraction, to see how that's not the way it has to go.
Sure, I hope so.
Yeah.
And that's, if I can.
You have a whole section. You have these boys going to a Catholic school when they're teenagers, and you have this priest character who's what we would call now a dissenting priest, and the bad effect he has on your friend and his faith. Could you talk about that a little bit? Do you see that as widespread?
I think so, and I was very fortunate in my case growing up. I would say that the environment for me was extremely orthodox overall, and so the heterodox voice stood out. It was very jarring to me as a young man. I think it's much more widespread in the broader environment, and I think is a massive tool of Satan right now in the current culture. One of the things that I tried to bring to the forefront in the novel is that we as a culture have lost a common interpretive sense. So we don't really know the rules of life or of art or of morality. We're not able to look at a situation or at a painting or at a person and know how to interpret it out of some kind of common cultural fund of experience. And so naturally we have to look to teachers to give us, guidance, when we encounter moral dilemmas or, beautiful artworks or other human beings. And unfortunately we have so many teachers who don't teach properly.
Yes. As a teacher myself, and especially as a convert from an atheist, totally skeptical background, after I found the glories of Catholic morality, it just I find it very disconcerting, this way that people just throw out any aspect of Catholic morality that they don't want to follow as, well, we don't have to follow those rules, God isn't about rules, as if.
Sure.
So I like to joke to my students, do you think if the traffic cop picks you up for speeding, that you could say to him, I'm not into rules, I'm into creative interpretation of driving?
Sure.
You think it would work? Because, even something like laws of that type, the law may be culturally defined because, of course, it's different when you have horses or cars that you're riding. See?
Right.
Of course, that's different. It changes with the culture. But the basic idea that you shouldn't be doing anything in such a way that you're endangering other people, that's basic natural law, right? So because this is fiction, instead of Daniel Fitzpatrick laying it out in the ways such as the way I just did, he can just show you by his depiction of this dissenting priest who's acting as if moral absolutes aren't absolute, and you can interpret things the way you feel inclined to in your own conscience, and so on and so forth. It comes together as part of his character instead of as essay, right? That's part of your purpose. Would that be part of your purpose?
Yes, absolutely. I would say so.
The whole thing takes place with this hurricane, and it happens that one of the greatest, I would say the greatest Catholic writer since Tolkien, the second half of the 20th century, Catholic fiction has been dominated by this famous writer, Michael O'Brien. He's most famous for the book Father Elijah. Anyhow, he wrote this beautiful, he read Daniel Fitzpatrick's book as a manuscript, and he wrote this very, very positive description of the book, saying this moving, evocative novel taking place during this hurricane. But what he sees is that the natural disaster is a metaphor for the devastating spiritual flood that has swept through a once Christian civilization, leaving inestimable damage, confusion, corruption, displacement, and death in its wake. So that's a beautiful description of how, without being, I don't know if the listener is familiar with the word didactic. It means teachers tend to pound things in, whereas literary writers are not didactic so much as they're evocative. They describe a whole thing, and then the reader can begin to see, oh, yes, this isn't just about a hurricane. Is that correct? Is that true?
Absolutely. Yes, and that's so I came across this interesting tidbit recently, and I'm forgetting the details, so you'll have to forgive my vagueness here. But the gist of it was that I think it was basically medieval Arabian psychologists, not that they would have been psychologists, but basically the equivalent, would treat insanity by reading fairy tales to people, which I think is just a wonderful thought. You think really the way that our minds are calibrated, it seems to me, to see the world and to respond in a sane way to the world is basically, when we're kids, we learn through stories and fairy tales, and I think that is the key role of the novelist, especially today, is to reignite the power of myth and of story in people's minds, especially because our schooling, our education does tend to be so didactic, I think, and there's a real lack, even in higher education in America of the power of stories, and so I think that's my aim as an author, is to bring stories into people's hearts, and through those stories, to evoke rather than to teach directly.
Well, for instance, I'm thinking that if you got this book and you gave it to someone who was going through, a young person who was going through a crisis of faith, they might be able, as they read it, to get the feeling, I want to be like the hero of this novel. I don't want to sink into this state of skepticism and confusion and despair, ultimately, where you could see this friend veering toward suicide. So right. I wanted to just talk to you about how to get the book. So if you're listening to this on WCAT Radio, which you probably are, you could just go to En Route Books, that's EN, capital ROUTE Books, which is on the same website, and you'll find it. But otherwise, if you put in Daniel Fitzpatrick, just Google Daniel Fitzpatrick and the title, Only the Lover Sings, it will come up right away, and you'll see how you could get hold of it. Let's see. What would you like to say more about your experience of writing the book?
Yes,
Do
it was.
you think is it going to, now that it's being published, do you think that you're going to write more books?
Yes, so I'm actually writing a second novel now, and then I'm also, this is more of a long-term project, I guess, just because of the exigencies of daily life as a parent. But I'm also working on a translation of the Divine Comedy. That's more of a pet project, I guess. But about halfway through the second novel now. And this first one...
What is the theme of the second novel?
Well, it's hard to say. So it's much more... I would say... So this first novel, of course, takes place over the span of, some 4 months in a young man's life. The next novel is much more concentrated in a way. Basically, it follows a similar character, though an older one, through one day in his life, and it takes place on Ash Wednesday, and it is basically a study, in some sense, of the psychology of daily life for a contemporary person. So it kind of follows him through his daily routine with his family, with his work life, with his mass attendance, and tries just through that, in some sense, extremely ordinary experience to get at the intense drama of each moment of the day, which is, that's always been a very deep concern of mine, is to remain aware of the intense implications of every moment.
Oh, one way of putting this that I could think of is, I would describe it after reading the book, is the whole idea of the microcosm, which is the idea of the microcosm, is that in some tiny micro moment can include a reflection of all of reality, right?
Yes.
So just a person deciding, say, should I confess this sin, and thinking about the nature of that experience that led into what he or she now sees as something sinful, can bring in the entire, can consolidate the microcosm of the whole reality of sin in the world. It would be the macrocosm, right?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Now, so that sounds very abstract and philosophical, but I assure you as a reader of this book that I want you to get the book, because I think you'll love how he does this in a way that's not at all abstract, that is this mingling of emotions and nature and spiritual experience. And I found his way of writing very youthful and fresh. And because I think I was thinking of this beforehand, I've probably read at least 1,000 novels in my life. Because I was brought up that novels were more important than babies. So I've always read novels. And so for me to find some writer being able to write in a fresh way is very surprising. And I think you will find that, too, in a way that nothing we say here could prepare you for. So you have to buy the book and immerse yourself in it, and then you will remember what I said and what he said.
Yes. That's very gratifying to hear, Rhonda.
So, again, get hold of this book by either putting in Daniel Fitzpatrick, Only the Loveless Things, or going to En route Books on the novels, and you'll find that among the novels of En route Books. And let's have a closing prayer. Why don't you say it, Daniel?
Sounds good. In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear God, we thank you for your providence by which you have led each of us together, by which you have called us to experience the grace of each moment in our lives. We ask that you bless us as we continue through our Lenten journey, and we ask that you bless the work of WCAT Radio and of Dr. Ronda Chervin, Dr. Sebastian Mahfood, and please bring us all into the light of your grace. Amen.
Amen.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.